Welcome to the True North Compliance Podcast, where we discuss regulatory and compliance issues for Canadian business.
Hello, I'm Sean O'Hara, and thanks for listening.
Welcome, everybody. My guest today is Simon Morris. He is a sculptor who lived and sculpted on Salt Spring Island for 30 years and is now based on Vancouver Island. He was inducted as a signature member of the Artists for Conservation Foundation in February 2020 and inducted as a member College of Fellows of the Royal Canadian Geographic Society in October 2021. He is the creator of two 9-foot-tall underwater bronze mermaids, the Emerald Princess in Mermaid Cove in Saltary Bay near Powell River, British Columbia, not that far from us, and Amphitrite at Sunset House, Grand Cayman, as well as the Guardian of the Reef, placed underwater at Dive Tech Resort in West Bay, Grand Cayman. Simon has also worked concurrently in the diving industry since 1973 for many of the major companies, including GM at Scuba Pro Canada, GM at Scuba Pro Canada, International Product Development Manager for Scuba Pro, and VP of Product Development and VP Product Development Manager for Bear, and retired as the sales manager for Shearwater Research, Inc. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Sean. It's nice to be here.
You're known for these breathtaking underwater bronzes and environmental pieces, but at the end of the day, you're also running a business in Canada. How did you first find yourself blending sculpture, diving, and conservation into a commercial practice? A lot of us don't think of those as in the same light. When did you start to realize that regulations and permits were going to be a big part of getting your work into the water and into public spaces?
Sean, I guess the answer to the first question of how did I find blending sculpture, diving, and conservation into commercial practice, that was sheerly by accident, just because I love sculpting and I love the ocean and scuba diving. And I started to realize that regulations were going to be a part of this almost immediately, but it started with the mermaid in Powell River. I've loved the ocean and the idea of scuba diving as long as I can remember, but I had to wait until I was 15 in 1973 to become scuba certified. By that time, I'd already started doing abstract welded steel sculpture with marine themes with an oxyacetylene torch. My dad set up a welding studio in our basement for me. I started this when I was about 13, 2 years before I started scuba diving, but I'd already been free diving for years. I guess my sculpture, my passion for diving in the ocean, and my love of marine life were all intertwined from the start. I started selling my earlier works in welded steel to friends and local dive shops right at the beginning. In fact, it helped me save the money to buy my first set of gear when I got certified. My first bronze sculpture was the 9-foot-tall mermaid, the Emerald Princess, sunk in a small cove in Saltary Bay near Powell River in March of 1989, within the confines of the Provincial Park. Shortly afterwards, the park was renamed Mermaid Cove Provincial Park. It immediately became apparent that we were going to need a permit to place her in the ocean, but the idea was novel at the time. This is 1988, 1989, and nobody really knew how to approach it. Finally, the government just asked us to apply for an ocean dumping permit. And I objected to that, saying she was a 9-foot-tall piece of art, not a piece of garbage to be dumped. And finally, they said, couldn't you just do it on a Sunday when no one's at work? So we did that, and this worked. And although it was a very public event with at least 1,000 spectators on the beach and several layers of government from local Powell River representatives, all the way up to Terry Huberts, who was the current Minister of Parks at the time, there was no further issue with the authorities.
That's quite the process. And wanting to call it, or wanting to use the ocean dumping permit.
That's all they had at the time.
And so now they've got more.
Oh yeah, there's a process now.
Okay. Was the park renamed Mermaid Cove Provincial Park because of your sculpture in there?
Correct. And it was actually added to the Canadian Hydrographic Survey. So if you have a marine chart of it there, Mermaid Cove is now listed in the official charts of the area.
That's quite an honor.
It was. That mermaid was absolutely a life-changing event. Put me on the map, literally and figuratively.
Yes, it would. So when you install a 13-foot bronze guardian or a mermaid on a reef, that's probably not something you just quietly drop off a boat at night or a Sunday in BC when they don't have regulations.
Yeah.
But today, can you take us through what it now takes from, say, the permits, the environmental assessments, any of the local approvals to put a sculpture in the ocean in Canada or anywhere else?
Sure. It definitely varies by location. In Canada, it's the most complicated here, dealing with not only several layers of government, but most importantly, the blessing of the relevant First Nations community is critical. It is the first questions asked by each of the other agencies. If you don't have the blessing of the First Nations, there's no point in trying to go any further. In Grand Cayman, where I have 2 pieces underwater already, the process is admittedly complicated and detailed, but it's relatively straightforward. It requires the completion of what's called a standard coastal works application process, which focuses mainly on environmental safety and issues. Once the application is complete, it's presented to the Department of Environment for review. If it satisfies their requirements, they forward it to the Cabinet of the government for final approval. We just received approval in October for my latest sculpture for Cayman, the Angel of the Reef. That process took about 30 months. In the United States, I'm currently working on a project to install between 6 and 10 large bronze sculptures in an underwater columbarium. A columbarium is the proper name for a memorial place for cremated remains, and it's near Destin on the Florida Panhandle. This region has created a mandate for themselves to become the #1 artificial scuba diving destination in the United States. The seabed in the region and the permit process is under the authority of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Okaloosa County. We had tried for 18 months to get a permit in Miami-Dade County with no success or progress whatsoever. Once we heard about Okaloosa County and Destin, we submitted the application for the Poseidon Memorial Reef, and we had the permit granted in 2 weeks. And now fundraising for the sculptures is happening now. But you also mentioned other places, or to put a permanent sculpture in the ocean or in a public place in Canada or abroad. I was fortunate enough to receive a commission to create a life-size bronze sculpture of Captain Henry Larson, who was an RCMP sergeant and skipper and captain of the RCMP vessel St. Roch. The St. Roch is the vessel that is housed in the large A-frame building at the Vancouver Maritime Museum in Kitsilano. Some people who saw the unveiling of my sculpture there happened to be part of the Winston Churchill Society in North Vancouver. They liked my work, and they came to me and asked me if I would be interested in doing a life-size sculpture of Winston Churchill. I was originally born in England, and so I jumped at the chance. And the most amazing thing was we couldn't find any public place in the Lower Mainland who felt that Winston Churchill was quote-unquote relevant today. And they had all the money in the world. Normally, when people approach me for a project, they're full of enthusiasm and they don't have the money to pull it off. The Winston Churchill Society had no trouble at all. We could not find a place publicly in Vancouver that was willing to accept a sculpture of Churchill. And that kind of shocked me because he had quite a influence on the Western world.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. We eventually got permission from a hotel in Vancouver that was building a bar in the hotel called Winston's, and it had a very British theme, and they said that we could put it at the entrance to the bar, but they wanted him holding a Scotch glass and a cigar. Churchill's great-great-granddaughter has complete global control over images used to portray Churchill. And because he was a known alcoholic, she won't have anything to do with anything representing alcohol to do with him. And she would not approve that design. And the hotel bar said, well, no Scotch glass, no sculpture. And so what would have been an absolutely lovely opportunity just faded away.
There's no location for that and no statue then to
That's
Churchill.
correct. Yeah. But it struck me that time and time again, he was considered to be not relevant to have a sculpture of him. And there were some people that said it's politically unsuitable to have the prime minister of another country represented here. That there were a number of excuses, but they all shocked me.
Wow. We could get into a further discussion as to the why and the current issues happening with a lot of sculptures around the West.
At the risk of getting into the weeds today, and I'll keep it very brief, in recent history in Canada, the United States, and abroad, sculptures of people whose historical figures, whose attitudes, statements, and quotes have become unpopular, are being torn down and removed and sometimes destroyed. And I have a problem with that for two reasons. First, as an artist, they're pieces of art that won't be recreated and represent a lot of work and love and passion by the artist. And the second thing is the age-old quote of, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So my personal belief in all of that is those sculptures could possibly be removed from public view or have a new plaque acknowledging the fact that their statements and history is no longer acceptable and that they had a good side and a bad side. But that's just my personal feeling about it. I don't think art should be destroyed.
I agree with you completely about not destroying art and putting something up just to acknowledge, if that's what people's concerns are, that we're praising and glorifying people, then to have something to give the other side so people can become at least aware of it instead of destroy. Because a lot of effort and love and skill from the artists goes into that and the community at the time.
Yes, and you can't erase history. You just need to educate people about it properly.
I've also heard the line recently that a society that hates its past has no future.
Oh, that's very good. That's very good.
So let's get back into the environment and the more acceptable sculptures or the other work that you're doing. You've always framed your work as pro-ocean and pro-conservation. What do you do to make sure that the materials that you use and the installation methods, and even if you have to do ongoing maintenance, does that align with best practices and environmental regulations to ensure that you're not accidentally harming the ecosystem you're trying to protect?
Yes, that's always been very important to me, Sean. And the fundamental material of all of my underwater work is called environmental bronze. And it's the same metal that's used to cast ships' propellers. It's been shown over decades to do no harm from the bronze sculptures that have been in place underwater for many decades. There's a sculpture in Pennicamp Park in Florida. It's called the Christ of the Abyss, and it was installed there on August the 25th in 1965. It is located in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and serves as a symbol of peace and understanding. It's covered with life, and this piece is a Christ figure in long robes with his arms upstretched to the surface, and he's looking up to welcome divers down. But it is a religious symbol, and interestingly enough, the American Association of Atheists tried for many years to have it removed because it is a religious symbol in a public park. And it got all the way to the Supreme Court over about a 10-year period. But eventually, a lone and quite small piece of coral started growing on his back. And once that piece of coral grew on the bronze, the government said, okay, we don't care about your religious beliefs. It's part of the reefs. It's staying. And that sculpture is still there today. My own sculpture, the Emerald Princess, my first mermaid in Powell River. British Columbia is one of the most incredible places in the world for encrusting marine life, and keeping her recognizable as a sculpture has been challenging over the years. When she has a lot of divers on her, it's not much of a problem. But years and years ago, the local dive shop went out of business. And for a while there were very few divers on her. And I went to see her for one of her birthdays, and she was absolutely covered in large white plumose anemones. And if you didn't know that there was a bronze sculpture under there, you would have swam right by it. And so she's always covered with algae and our local encrusting marine life and these anemones. The guardian of the reef in Grand Cayman has the beginnings of a large barrel sponge growing out of his neck. And so they do get quite covered with life. The concrete that we use for the bases is always formulated to have a pH of between 6.5 and 7.5. And this range of pH has been termed critter friendly by the Reef Ball Foundation, which is one of the world's largest builders of concrete reef structures for environmental remediation. They place these structures literally all over the world, and they have determined that that pH range actually attracts encrusting marine life. And my next sculpture in Cayman, the Angel of the Reef, will actually use what's called a layer cake style reef ball as part of her base. We always check the bottoms to where the sculptures are going to go, and we choose flat sandy bottoms where there is no life, and samples are taken and analyzed for existing life and existing pollutants to provide a baseline for ongoing impact studies. And the sculptures themselves become focal points for life and become small artificial reefs in their own right, so that we do everything that we can to make sure that we do no harm. In fact, the first mermaid, the Emerald Princess at Powell River, we actually discovered a large boulder sitting on a relatively flat plain, and we drilled 2 large holes in that boulder and designed the mermaid sculptures so that there were 2 24-inch long by 1.5-inch diameter stainless steel threaded rods coming out of her tail, and she is just pushed into the rock and is resting there looking like her tail is just brushing up against the rock. So she has absolutely zero footprint on the seabed that wasn't there before.
Wow. So these don't get cleaned off then once the sea life starts to go there, or?
That depends on who puts it there and how often it gets dived and what people want to see. A lot of like for instance, most people don't know this, but you can actually annoy a plumose anemone. So if you bother it a little bit, it'll simply get up and swim away and find somewhere else to live. And that's what happened when she became completely festooned with them 15 years ago or so. Doesn't do any harm to the anemones. And now you can tell that she's a mermaid again. Some people, like the people that installed the Guardian of the Reef at Dive Tech in Cayman, they have left it absolutely, I suppose the word could be pristine because it's never been cleaned, but it's getting so much life on it, it's hard to make out the sculptural detail. Other places, you can use a scrubby or something like that to clean them up. I'm always against doing any damage to the environment or sea creatures, but algae is not an endangered species. So if it gets cleaned off, well, every once in a while, it isn't doing any harm to anybody.
So we clean it off, everything. So that would be initially then keeping it clean without having something start there would be the intent.
Yes. And in places like Grand Cayman, they are so heavily dived and people touch them all the time that it's hard for things to get much of a footing there. The mermaid in Powell River, when she didn't get dived for a while, that was the most extreme case of how much life can grow on a sculpture quite quickly.
Something divers do then? They go down and they touch these. It's not like in a park. They usually don't go up and touch a sculpture.
They absolutely do. Divers are 12-year-olds, and I can tell you that there was very little growth or algae on the boobs of the mermaids.
Great. Yeah, fascinating. You've dealt with everyone, sounds like, from local counselors, tourism boards, environmental agencies, port authorities, park authorities. What have you learned about navigating those relationships so that a creative, conservation-focused project like yours can get a yes from everybody instead of dying in a pile of paperwork or going nowhere like a Winston Churchill statue?
And probably the most relevant scenario for this interview is I am currently working to place the second casting of the Guardian of the Reef sculpture at the Ogden Point Breakwater in Victoria. Here in BC, and specifically in Victoria, the process is multiple steps, and the very first step is talk to the First Nations first. It is the Songhees First Nations in Victoria that is in control of the Ogden Point area, and as a sign of respect, to get their blessing before going any further, I have already been in touch with them. I had the pleasure of meeting our local MP, Elizabeth May, at a business breakfast meeting in December, and I was telling her about this, and she's actually been extremely helpful in connecting me with the right people, both with First Nations and with some of the other government agencies. So once you get the blessing of First Nations, and I've already spoken to them, and I've explained the process and the sculpture and where I want to put it, and it is being placed before what they refer to as their Elders Council. And then I simply have to wait until the next time they meet, and I hope to hear back from them in a positive manner. And if I do, the next party that I go to is the ECCC, the Environmental Climate Change Canada organization, and they have to give their approval. If it's in a park, whether it be municipal, provincial, or national, I have to get the Parks Board approval. And then DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, plays a very large role. They ultimately also have yay or nay authority. We have to give them the exact GPS coordinates, ground conditions, samples of the sand for both life and existing pollutants. And just on the other side of the Ogden Point breakwater is a Canadian Coast Guard base. So they have interest in the area. So it has to go past them. You have to go through Transport Canada about the water depth because of the Hazards to Navigation Act. You certainly don't want a freighter banging into the sculpture. And at the place where we hope to put the Guardian of the Reef at Ogden Point is I guess it's about halfway down the breakwater, where it takes a fairly sharp sort of 30-degree turn to the right. And the water at the bottom of, I don't know if you're familiar with the structure, but it's built of large concrete blocks. And at this point, the concrete blocks end and the flat sandy seabed is at about 70 feet. So if the Guardian on the base is 15 or 20 feet high, that still leaves 50 feet of water above it, which is well above their 10-meter minimum. So we should be okay there. And finally, the Victoria Harbour Authority is responsible for the safety of all of the infrastructure in and around the harbour. And finally, it has to be posted publicly. We can monitor public opinion and allow any residents or businesses the opportunity to object. The Ogden Point Breakwater is already the most popular recreational dive site in southern Vancouver Island. So yes, the goal is to have more diving traffic there, but it's a long way away from local homes. There's a coffee shop at the entrance to the breakwater that would come very busy with cold and thirsty divers afterwards. We're not anticipating any trouble there. Overall, it's important to make them understand this process isn't new. It has a successful track record and has a very positive impact on regional tourism. And the number one bonus is that it also raises public awareness of the need to protect our fragile marine environment. So those are the steps, and they change depending on where you are, but not a huge amount.
That's a lot to go through. So do you do that yourself, or do you have a team, or is it whoever wants it in there?
Generally, the way that it's worked is individuals or corporations have come to me and said, hey, we'd like one of your sculptures here. And I say to them, absolutely, here's how much the sculpture will cost. You go get the permit. And so I told you earlier the story about the Emerald Princess in Powell River, which was done before really that there was a process in place. But both of them, the ones in Grand Cayman, I had to get the coastal works application, and it's complicated but straightforward. And there are some fundamental differences in the approach in different countries. But the most important factor is learn the local rules and regulations, get to know the people involved, get them to see the upsides, and get the paperwork done the right time. Nobody wants more work. The biggest difference between Canada and other jurisdictions is the absolute necessity to have the approval and blessing of the Indigenous people before you go any further. And as far as the cost of the sculpture, as far as my price is concerned, the cost for the application is normally borne by the client. So the price of the sculpture it's primarily based on the size and casting complexity of the sculpture rather than regulatory issues. But I do spend a lot of time working with the clients, and that's just part of the sales cycle for wanting to put sculptures in an unusual place.
Oh, fascinating. That's a lot of different levels.
Yeah, you have to cross your T's and dot your I's, that's for sure.
Your more recent pieces have dealt directly with climate change and Arctic habitat loss. Are there any constraints, maybe, let's say, on how blunt you can be with that message when your work is supported by local groups or tourism bodies or sponsors?
Yes, they are, but I don't really feel it, because all of my art is focused on marine life, marine mythology, and the stories of mariners and explorers. And I try to communicate my feelings about the ocean and the environment through the medium of bronze. And it's a message of love, hope, and empathy for the creatures that we share the planet with. I don't criticize any organizations or blame any one individual or nation in particular. Every one of us knows that the general activities of the human race have been detrimental to the planet, and that we each need to consider our actions and our practices to reduce and remediate the damage. I've never had a negative comment about my work, and most people who know of me and my art know that I often use the sale of my work to raise funds for environmental organizations that have goals that match mine. And it's one of the reasons why I've been inducted into groups like the Artists for Conservation Foundation, the Ocean Artists Society, and also as a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographic Society.
Yes, you've supported environmental organizations and so on. So beyond the laws and the permits, what voluntary standards do you hold yourself to, whether that's in sourcing materials, working with local communities? And how do these impact, say, your production costs, your timelines, and even the prices you have to charge?
My first rule is first do no harm. There isn't a lot of point in promoting environmental art that harms the environment. I use any local regulations as the bare minimum, and I make sure that the materials I use are safe and the companies that I deal with share my values. We're always very careful about where we put the pieces and that we do no harm in the actual installation either. This does make my underwater work a bit more expensive than normal. A piece that would be going on to land, for instance. But my clients also appreciate and understand the concept.
So what about say safety, and as people interact, divers are going down and touch it. So is there insurance issues or even liability issues that you as an artist have to think through?
As an artist, I try and make sure that my sculptures are inherently safe. The clients themselves are responsible for diver safety once the piece is in the water, and they carry the insurance and liability issues. My contracts with the clients outline the possible pitfalls and provide specific details on the construction of the bases and the installation of the piece. I design the bases to provide enough mass and weight and surface area to provide stability even in the most extreme conditions. During Hurricane Ivan in Grand Cayman, the waves were so huge that the troughs between the waves exposed the head of the mermaid Amphitrite in about 55 feet of water 3 times during that storm. She took the full brunt of the storm and didn't move an inch, so we were very lucky there. Also, I make sure that the sculptures have no pointed or sharp edges, because one of the fundamental reasons for putting a sculpture underwater is not just because it's for tourism and it'll attract a lot of divers and generate a lot of revenue. A lot of these diving resorts have quite a high percentage of customers who only dive when they're traveling. And they very often go quite long periods between dives, and they need some practice for their skills. And the other group are people that dive locally in cold water in dry suits and 30 pounds of lead and probably a total weight package of between 80 and 90 pounds. And then they jump in the water in Grand Cayman with 4 pounds of lead on a belt and no suit. So it's an entirely different environment. So a lot of them use a dive on one of my sculptures or any other underwater sculpture or attraction to get not the novices, but people unused to diving in those conditions to do a little bit of learning about their buoyancy and everything. So sometimes they're floundering around a little bit at the beginning. So you want to make sure that you don't have a big sharp spear sticking up that they could poke themselves on. And if you look at the photograph of the Guardian of the Reef in Grand Cayman, he was originally designed to have a trident that he was holding up. And the client absolutely didn't want, quote unquote, a weapon to do with the sculpture. So we replaced it with a sphere that is meant to represent the globe of the earth. And so it's dull. I don't find it particularly attractive, but it's certainly safe.
That would be messy. People were
Bad publicity.
probably not sharp enough to damage a tank, but just people in general. People are more vulnerable in a diving tank.
Yeah, you have to be careful.
So your work is at the crossroads of art, tourism, and environmental advocacy. How do the regulations around the claims, charitable donations, or co-marketing with dive operators and resorts shape the way that you talk about your projects in your marketing and fundraising? And have you ever had to pull back on how you tell the story?
No, actually, I guess it's part of the way that I approach the projects. I actually have never had to pull back on how a story is told. I've never tried to be an aggressive activist or that kind of agent of change. I just have always wanted to express my love of the ocean and working with like-minded environmental organizations for my fundraising efforts. The reason that I got into working in bronze for this is that I am extremely passionate about the ocean, everything that we've had to do with it and its inhabitants. But I am not eloquent enough to explain to people how I feel, so I have to do it through my art. And when I have an unveiling and I have a room full of people with tears in their eyes, I know that I have reached out and I've grabbed them by the gut and I've made my point. And that is all I ever attempt to do. And In respect for the organizations that have inducted me as a member, they have their own rules and standards, and I would never act outside of those guidelines. They include pretty well-known organizations like the Royal Canadian Geographic Society, the Artists for Conservation Foundation, the Ocean Artists Society, and the Ocean Futures Society. I would never do anything to upset them or cause any friction there. I always try to promote the benefits of positive action, not criticize the negative.
Do you have advice for other, say, Canadian artists and designers who want to operate in these highly regulated environments? What's the key things you would tell them about dealing with compliance and red tape?
I'd have to say that the number one thing I've learned is patience. I am not a naturally patient person, but I've learned that you've just got to have it. I worked on one project in Washington State for a large underwater piece for the Washington Scuba Alliance. And together we spent 18 years trying to get a permit and gave up a year ago. You have to be aware that it's a lot like actors auditioning for a part. You are not going to get them all. You have to go into each one with the same amount of enthusiasm and assume that you're just that this one will go, and you have to have that level of enthusiasm all the way until somebody with the power to say no says no, or to go ahead. It's also important to tailor your message to the local audience and be cognitive and respectful of local customs and the administrative requirements. You have to do your own research first, gathering information from reliable sources around you. There's no point in going down a path that's got a gate to it that you didn't know about. You need to build a team of local champions who are passionate about the cause and willing to do some of the legwork. It's too much for one person to do, so look for experts in the field that may want to help and be of use. And lastly, you have to go through all of these government agencies, but don't expect them to drop everything and get on the bandwagon, because they've got little to gain personally, and most of these projects are just often a lot of extra and unusual work for them with no benefit to them. So be appreciative of that fact when making your initial inquiries.
So you've seen a lot, permits taking 2 weeks to 18 years and then giving up and everything in between.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the Poseidon Memorial Reef permit in Okaloosa County, in a town called Destin on the Florida Panhandle, their city council and the county council realize how important scuba diving is to their local economy. They are huge in the fishing business. It's an enormous charter boat center. They actually refer to themselves as the world's luckiest fishing village. So fishing and water sports are huge there, and diving is also very big. But most of the water surrounding the town of Destin is flat, sandy bottom. It isn't the most interesting diving in the world. The water is warm, it's clear, there's thousands of people there. But they realized quite a few years ago that if they were going to be very successful, they needed to make the diving more interesting. So it became a mandate to them to create what they call fish habitats and artificial reefs. They've sunk probably 100 ships there, and they are in the process of sinking the SS United States, which is one of the largest passenger vessels ever built. And when it sinks, it will be the largest artificial reef ever sunk, and it'll be sunk about 5 miles offshore of Destin. So they go all the way from little fishing boats all the way up to the SS United States, which has received an enormous amount of publicity in Florida for this. So they are very proactive. They understand that it's good for the environment. Artificial reefs attract first encrusting life and then juvenile and prey species, but they also attract predators. So if you attract the juvenile and prey species and don't give them a place to hide, you're basically setting up a lunch bar for the bigger stuff. And so with the Poseidon Memorial Reef that we are building in Destin, as we build the larger structures for the placement of cremated human remains, as I said, it's a columbarium, we are building a lot of three-dimensional rubble between the structures and around them so that all of the smaller creatures have a place to hide when the barracudas and the sharks come for lunch.
That would a land equivalent be like reforestation, go through an area that's cleared out, or even reclamation from a desert? You go in, you put something, and everything else comes in as a result?
Very similar. Even coral sends out polyps into the water column, and they float around for a time until they find a place to grow on. And coral likes to grow on a certain type of encrusting calcareous algae. And even though the little coral polyps don't have a brain and they're blind, they know what their preference is to land on. So if this encrusting coralline or calcareous algae is present, even the coral polyps will start to land there. And as this encrusting life starts to trap algae and nutrients and everything, this is where they become nurseries for the smaller creatures. So if you put anything in the ocean that isn't poisonous, it will attract life. And the first artificial reefs were actually built by fishermen, not divers, because they realized if you put a bunch of stuff in the ocean, then fish will come to them. Unfortunately, in the early days, they used huge piles of tires, which doesn't have a good environmental impact, and a lot of those are being removed now.
Yeah, that would be damaging.
I think the whole permitting of it is a means to an end. It's something that I have to do in order to do what I want to do. The thrill of having the opportunity to dive on one of my sculptures with people that I do and don't know is always amazing. I love to see the look in their eyes, and I feel that when we do that, they have an understanding of the way that I feel. And I think probably the example of that sticks out in my mind more than anything is shortly after we placed the Emerald Princess in Powell River, the British Columbia Association of Disabled Divers got together and did a fundraiser and got a permit and funding to build a wheelchair ramp down the rocky foreshore from the parking lot in Mermaid Cove Provincial Park to just below the high tide line. And when it was opened, which gave disabled divers wheelchair access to get in the water. And when that was officially opened, I think I'm guessing 1991, it became the first official disabled access dive site in British Columbia. And a lot of us went up there to do this. And it is a very rocky foreshore. It was very nice to have a concrete ramp to go down as an able-bodied diver. But we were pushing people in wheelchairs down to the water where they could then swim away, because people aren't disabled in the ocean. It's an amazing transformation to watch. But the particular diver that I accompanied was a young woman who was blind. And this was done in March, I think, of 91. And the temperature and the water temperature, it was cold. And we went down, I held her hand, because obviously she couldn't see where she was going. And when we got to the mermaid in about 60 feet of water, she took off both of her neoprene gloves, put them in the pockets of her buoyancy compensator, and then ran her hands over the mermaid from the top of her hair to the tip of her tail for about 20 minutes. And I was getting cold just watching her. And then when she was finished, she put her gloves on and we turned around and we surfaced. And she said to me, she said, "She's beautiful." And that was one of the most satisfying moments.
Oh, yeah. That's very nice.
Yeah. And that's kind of the reason why I do it all.
Wow, you've contributed so much.
I look at it that I've been incredibly fortunate to have had the right upbringing in the right place. My father was an artist and he recognized that I am not a two-dimensional artist. I'm not a painter. I have terrible color sense. He was a great graphic artist and an oil and watercolor painter, as is my eldest sister. But I'm just no good at it. And he recognized that I had a need to create art, but I wasn't doing it with the right mediums or the right way. And it was he that got me involved in three-dimensional welded steel sculpture, as I said, when I was about 13. How many people's dads set them up a welding studio in the basement when they're 13? So I've just been very fortunate to have I am the result of a perfect set of circumstances. I'm very lucky.
Thank you, Simon. What is the best way for people to either get a hold of you or to see your work?
The quickest and easiest way is to go to my website, which is www.sculptorsimonmorris.com. And in that, there is a contact page with the ability to email me, and they can simply go to the contact page and drop me an email.
That in the show notes as well. My guest today has been Simon Morris, who is a sculptor who's contributed a lot to underwater diving, to the environment, and responsible scuba tourism and environmental awareness. Thank you so much for being here, Simon.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
And that's a wrap.